A cold real estate CEO named Giselle Harmon sold a rotting garage for $1,000 to an unemployed mechanic she dismissed as a broke dreamer. She even smiled when she signed the papers, certain she had unloaded worthless junk. 6 months later, that same man stared back at her from the cover of a business magazine, his worth past $1 million. And Giselle stood in the doorway of that old building, realizing she had thrown away the most valuable thing she ever owned. But what was hidden inside that garage, and why did only he see it? The factory district on the east edge of Halford had been dying for years, and the men who once worked there had scattered to whatever town still had jobs. Caleb Merritt had not scattered. He stayed in the small rented room above a shuttered hardware store, eating cheap spending less and reading the same worn notebook every night, the way other men read scripture. The notebook had belonged to his father, who had run a one-bay garage until the day his hands stopped working, and on its first page in heavy block letters were the only words Caleb had ever truly lived by. Other men see the rust. You look for the metal underneath it. His father had written that line after restoring a wreck nobody else would touch, and he had repeated it so often that it stopped being advice and became the shape of how his son saw the world. Caleb had grown up under cars, learning to listen to engines the way some people listen to music, and he had carried that ear into a good job at a regional parts manufacturer, where he was the man they called when nothing else worked. Then the merger came. A larger company swallowed the smaller one. The accountants drew their lines, and Caleb's entire division was crossed out in a single afternoon. There was no ceremony to it. A man in a pressed shirt thanked him for his service, handed him a folder, and that was the end of 11 years. He did not shout. He simply gathered his tools, drove home in a truck that needed brakes he could no longer afford, and began the slow business of surviving on nothing. Across town, in a glass office that caught the morning light, Giselle Harmon was doing the opposite of surviving. She ran the largest real estate firm in the county, and she had built it on a single unshakable belief that everything had a number and that she was better than anyone alive at finding it. She read properties the way a surgeon reads an X-ray, cold and certain, and she had never once been wrong in a way that cost her. Her colleagues admired her. Her competitors feared her. Almost no one liked her, and she had decided long ago that being liked was a luxury for people who did not win. That spring, Giselle's firm closed on a sprawling industrial lot on the east edge of town, 11 acres of cracked concrete and forgotten buildings that she intended to flatten and resell once the new infrastructure plans pushed property values up. She had walked the lot exactly once in heels with 2 assistants trailing behind her holding tablets. She had not gone inside most of the structures. There was no reason to. Her appraisal was about location and dirt, not about whatever ruined junk the previous owners had abandoned when the bank took everything. That previous owner mattered, though no one on Giselle's team bothered to learn his story. The old lot had belonged to a man who collected cars the way some men collect regrets, quietly and obsessively, until the debts caught up with him. When the foreclosure came, he left in the night and left almost everything behind, and the paperwork that should have inventoried the contents of his buildings had been lost somewhere between 3 lawyers and a bankruptcy court. To the county, the structures were listed as empty. To Giselle, they were a line item marked for demolition. Caleb heard about the garage the way he heard about most things now. Second-hand in a diner over coffee he nursed for an hour to justify the seat. 2 men at the counter were laughing about the real estate company dumping the worthless buildings on the east lot, selling them off for scrap money just to avoid the cost of hauling them down. One of them mentioned the old garage at the back of the property, the one with the collapsed roofline going for almost nothing. Caleb listened without looking up, and something in his father's voice stirred behind his ribs. He drove out the next morning. The lot was exactly as ugly as promised, a graveyard of rusted fences and weeds breaking through pavement. But the garage at the back made him slow the truck and stop. It was a long, low building with a sagging tin roof and a wall that had cracked from foundation to eave, and every instinct a normal man had would have told him to keep driving. Caleb felt the opposite. He felt the way his father used to look at a dead engine, the quiet certainty that something was still in there. He walked the perimeter twice. He noticed the location first because location was the easy part. The new bypass plans he had read about in the paper would run a connector road within half a mile of this lot, and anyone who understood how towns grew could see that this dead corner would not stay dead for long. But it was more than the dirt. There was a smell coming off the building that he knew in his bones, old oil and cold steel and rubber gone hard with age. The smell of machines that had been loved once and then left. A man in a company windbreaker was leaning against a clipboard near the gate, bored and cold, clearly drawing the short straw of babysitting a sale nobody cared about. Caleb asked him plainly whether the garage at the back was part of what they were selling off, and the man shrugged and said the whole row of junk was being unloaded, that someone from the firm was coming out that afternoon to sign whatever needed signing. Caleb said he would wait. The man looked at his worn jacket and his old truck and clearly decided he was harmless and went back to his clipboard. Giselle arrived at 2 o'clock in a car worth more than the entire block, irritated that the matter was important enough to drag her out personally, and yet too small to delegate cleanly. A buyer had surfaced for one of the scrap structures, and her assistant had insisted she close it herself because the man had asked for her by name. She stepped out, scanned the lot with the flat efficiency of someone counting losses, and found a tall, quiet man in coveralls standing near the worst building on the property, as though he were guarding something. "You're the one interested in the garage," she said, more statement than question. Caleb nodded once and told her he was. She looked him over and did the arithmetic she always did. The cheap boots, the truck with the failing brakes, the calm that poor men sometimes wore when they had nothing left to lose. She had met 100 men like him, men who dreamed in the language of someday and never closed a single deal, and she filed him under the same heading without a second thought. "It's structurally condemned in everything but paperwork," she said, the way someone reads a warning label. "The roof is gone, the walls split. You'd be buying the right to clean up somebody else's mess." She named the price almost as an afterthought, $1,000, and the number came out wrapped in something close to amusement. To her, it was a rounding error, a way to avoid demolition costs a favor she was doing herself disguised as a favor to a fool. What surprised her was that he did not flinch and did not haggle. Most men in his position would have tried to talk her down to 500 just to prove they were shrewd. Caleb simply asked whether the price included everything inside the building, and she gave a short laugh and told him he was welcome to whatever rats and rotted tires he found in there, that it was all the same garbage to her. He said he would take it. He counted out the money and worn bills from an envelope he had clearly emptied to be here, and the sight of it made her smile widen, because to her it confirmed everything. "You know," she said, signing the transfer with a pen that probably cost more than his weekly food, "I admire the optimism. But land like this only pays off for people who can afford to wait, and roofs like that only cost money you don't have. I'd hate for you to learn that the expensive way." It was not kindness. It was the small cruelty of a person who enjoyed being right dressed up as advice. Caleb took the key and the paper and thanked her without heat, and she drove off feeling she had done a clean morning's work. He stood alone in front of the building for a long moment. After her car disappeared, the key cold in his palm, the weight of the last of his savings now gone. Then he unlocked the side door, forced it against years of swollen wood, and stepped into the dark. Dust hung in the bars of light that fell through the broken roof, and the air was thick and still. At first he saw only what everyone else had seen, shapes under tarps, junk under decades of grime, the skeleton of a forgotten place. He pulled the first tarp back almost gently, the way his father had taught him to uncover something that might still matter. Beneath it, under a skin of dust, sat a low-curved body of dark steel, the unmistakable line of a machine, built in an era when cars were sculpted instead of stamped. His breath caught. He moved to the next shape and pulled that cover too, and then the next. And with each tarp, the dark room gave up another secret, until he had counted 8 of them. 8 cars lined in 2 silent rows sleeping under the ruined roof. He knew what he was looking at, because the notebook had taught him to know. His father had written pages on cars exactly like these, the rare ones, the ones whose value did not show through the rust to an untrained eye. Caleb crouched beside the nearest one, wiped a circle clean on a fender, and read the badge underneath, and his hands were not entirely steady. These were not junk. These were the kind of machines that collectors chased across the country, the kind that turned ruined men rich and made fools out of anyone who had walked past them without looking. For a while he simply sat on an overturned crate in the cold and let the size of it settle on him. The woman in the expensive car had sold him 8 fortunes for $1,000 because she had measured the dirt and never opened the door. The thought did not make him feel triumphant. It brought on the strange, heavy quiet his father used to fall into when a job turned out to matter more than anyone expected. The quiet of a man who suddenly understood he was holding something that could change everything or destroy him trying. Because that was the truth underneath the luck, and Caleb was too much his father's son to pretend otherwise. The cars were treasures, but they were ruined treasures. Every one of them needing thousands of hours and dollars he didn't have to bring back to life. He could sell them as they sat dusty and broken to the first dealer who walked through the door, and he would walk away with enough money to be comfortable and safe for a long time, a poor man made suddenly whole. Or he could do the other thing. He could bet everything, the last of his money, and all the time he had left before the bank stopped being patient, on restoring them himself, on the gamble that the metal underneath was worth more than the rust on top. One path was safe and small. The other was the kind of bet that ended careers, and his father's voice in the notebook had never once recommended the safe path. He stayed in the garage until the light failed and the cars became shapes again. Then he stepped outside, locked the swollen door behind him, and called the only man he trusted with something like this. Owen Brandt had worked the line beside him for 9 years before the same merger had thrown them both out an older man, with bad knees and good hands, who had given up looking for work and started talking about leaving town for good. Caleb told him he needed to see something, and that he would not believe it until he did. Owen came out the next morning grumbling about the cold, and the drive certain that Caleb had finally cracked under the strain of being broke. He stopped grumbling the moment the tarps came off. He walked down the row of cars, slowly touching each fender with the reverence of a man in a church. And when he reached the end, he turned to Caleb with an expression caught somewhere between joy and fear. "Do you have any idea what this is going to take?" he said quietly. "Or what it's going to cost us if you're wrong?" Caleb did not answer right away. He pulled his father's notebook from his jacket and opened it to the first page to the line in heavy block letters, and he handed it to Owen so the older man could read the words for himself in the dim, dust-filled light. Owen read it twice, then closed the cover and looked again at the 8 sleeping machines, and something in his tired face settled into a decision. "All right," he said. "Where do we start?" Caleb looked down the row of cars and made the choice that would either build him or bury him. He would not sell. He would restore them one at a time, starting with the one that needed him least, and he would use whatever it brought to fund the next, and the next, until either the work was done or the money was gone. He did not say it like a man dreaming. He said it like a man reading a number off a page, the way a certain CEO across town read numbers, except that he was reading the one she had never bothered to see. Outside, the wind moved through the broken roof and made the whole building groan, and somewhere across Halford, Giselle Harmon was already forgetting that the morning had happened at all. She had closed a small, clean deal with a poor man who would learn his lesson, and she had moved on to larger and more interesting things, certain as always that she had read the property correctly. She had measured the rust to the penny. She had simply never once thought to look beneath it. The garage taught Caleb fast what $1,000 really bought, which was the right to suffer for something. He and Owen worked under a roof that leaked in a dozen places, and the first hard rain came through the worst of those gaps and pooled across the floor of the second bay, soaking into the underside of a car they had spent 2 weeks cleaning. Caleb found the damage at dawn, knelt in the cold water, and understood that the building itself was now an enemy he had to fight before he could fight anything else. They patched the roof with salvaged tin and tar. They could barely afford climbing up in freezing wind to nail down sheets that fought them the whole way. Every dollar they did not spend on parts went into keeping the structure standing, and every dollar they spent on the structure was a dollar that could not go into the cars. Caleb watched his savings drain away in a way that felt almost physical, like blood, until the envelope that had once held his cushion against disaster held only a few folded bills and a list of things he still could not buy. There was no crew, only the two of them, an older man with knees that screamed every morning, and a younger one running on coffee and stubbornness. They worked 12 and 14 hours in a space they could not properly heat, breathing the smell of solvent and cold metal, and there were nights Owen lowered himself onto an oil drum and admitted plainly that he did not know if they would make it. Caleb never argued with him. He simply opened the notebook to the first page, set it where Owen could see it, and went back to work, and the older man always followed. Caleb chose the cars in order of difficulty, easiest. First, exactly as his father would have, and the machine that needed him least was a Mustang from the late 1960s, a fastback whose body had survived the years better than the rest. It was still a wreck by any honest measure. Its engine seized its interior, gone to rot its paint, dead under decades of grime, but its bones were straight, and its rarity was real. Caleb decided that this car would either prove his entire bet or end it, because he could not afford to be wrong twice. The work on the Mustang became a kind of religion. Caleb rebuilt the engine piece by piece, machining what he could not buy, coaxing old metal back into tolerance, with a patience that bordered on tenderness. Owen handled the body, cutting out the rot, and welding in new steel, sanding until his hands cramped, matching the original paint from a faded chip, the way a forger matches a master's brushstroke. They argued about everything, and agreed about the only thing that mattered, which was that it had to be perfect. It took them the better part of 2 months working without rest. When the Mustang finally ran, the sound of it filling the broken garage was the first thing in a long time that made Owen smile without effort, a deep, clean idle that meant the gamble had teeth. Caleb stood listening to it the way his father used to listen, head tilted, eyes half closed, and for that moment, the cold and the debt and the patched roof did not exist. There was only the engine alive again, telling him he had been right. Selling it was harder than building it, because Caleb had no name and no reputation, and no reason for anyone serious to trust him. He photographed the car, carefully wrote an honest listing, and reached out to the small world of collectors who chased machines like this one. Most ignored him. One did not. A serious collector from 2 states over drove out to see the Mustang in person, walked around it 3 times, without a word, ran a hand along the flawless paint, and then asked Caleb the only question that counted, which was who had done the work. When Caleb said he had the man studied his face to see if it was a lie, and found that it was not. The offer came that afternoon, just under $100,000 more money than Caleb had seen in one place in his life, enough to erase his debt and refill his envelope and prove every doubter wrong in a single transaction. He shook the man's hand and felt the ground shift under him because he understood that this was no longer about surviving the winter. This was the moment the whole thing changed shape. That night, Caleb did not celebrate. He sat in the garage with the money confirmed and the 7 remaining cars sleeping under their tarps, and he let himself see the larger picture for the first time. The cars were a fortune, yes, but a fortune that would eventually run out 8 machines, and then nothing. The land, though the dead corner everyone had written off, was a different kind of value entirely, and the bypass connector was no longer a rumor in a newspaper, but a project with stakes already driven into the ground. He drove the perimeter of the old lot slowly the next morning, seeing it now the way Giselle Harmon saw property in numbers and futures, except that he could also see the thing she never could, the work that turned ruined places into valuable ones. He was not a man restoring cars to survive anymore. He was a man with capital, a proven skill, and a piece of ground that the whole town was about to need. And somewhere in that drive, the dream stopped being about getting by and became about building something that would outlast him. He used the Mustang money the way a careful man uses a lever. He paid off the bank, bought the additional parcels of the old lot that the firm had not yet flipped, picking them up cheap before the connector road made them expensive, and he registered the business under a name he had carried in his head since the first night under the tarps. Merit Auto Works existed now in ink, indeed a real company with a real address, even if that address was still a half-collapsed garage held together with salvaged tin. The next cars came faster because he could finally afford help. He brought on 2 younger mechanics who had heard about the Mustang and wanted to learn, then a third. And Owen, who had once talked about leaving town, now ran the floor like a man 20 years younger. Word moved the way it does in that world quietly, and then all at once, and the first outside contracts arrived owners of rare machines, asking whether Merit Auto Works would restore their cars too, trusting Caleb's hands with fortunes of their own. Success brought its own weight, and Caleb felt it press down even as the company grew. The contracts meant deadlines. The deadlines meant payroll. The payroll meant that a single failure now took other people down with him, not just himself. He had traded the clean terror of being broke for the more complicated fear of being responsible. And there were nights he stood in the newly roofed garage and understood that he had built something that could now fall on him from a much greater height. The car that carried that fear was the Pantera. It was the rarest of the 8, and by far the most ruined and Italian-bodied machine, with an American engine, the kind of car that broke restorers, and Caleb had saved it for last, precisely because he had known it would. Its body was a map of corrosion, its drivetrain a puzzle of parts no longer made, and every shop he consulted for the impossible pieces either could not help or quoted numbers that made Owen wince. It was the hardest thing any of them had ever attempted, and the calendar gave them no room to be gentle about it. Caleb sank money into it that the company could not really spare, betting that a finished Pantera would not just sell, but would announce Merit Auto Works to the entire collecting world as a serious house. The costs climbed past every estimate. Parts had to be fabricated from scratch, fitted, refitted, scrapped, and fabricated again, the team working in shifts to keep the deadline alive while payroll kept coming due. Owen, who rarely showed worry anymore, started showing it again, reminding Caleb quietly that one bad outcome on this car could swallow everything the Mustang had built. There was no safe way to recover the money sunk into the Pantera, except to put it in front of the only people who would ever pay what it was worth, and that meant a public auction. Caleb made the decision, knowing exactly what it was, the largest bet of his life, laid on a table for the whole industry to watch. If the Pantera failed to draw real bids, the loss would not just hurt. It would mark him brand Merit Auto Works as a shop that overreached, and the trust he had built one handshake at a time would evaporate. If it succeeded, though it would carry him into a tier he had only read about in his father's notebook. The auction house that agreed to feature the car was a real one, the kind serious collectors flew in to attend, and as the date approached, Caleb finished the Pantera in a fever of final work, dialing in the engine, perfecting the paint, until the ruined machine he had bought for a fraction of $1,000 sat gleaming under the lights like something that had never known a single flake of corrosion. 6 months almost to the day had passed since he forced open that swollen door. He did not know that Giselle Harmon would be there. She came not for the car, but because the auction was an event, in the kind of circles she moved in a room full of money she liked to be seen standing in. Her own project on the east lot had stalled in the slow, grinding trouble of permits and shifting plans, and she had come to the auction half to forget about it, with no idea that the two things had anything to do with each other. She recognized the face before she understood why. A tall, quiet man stood beside the most talked-about car in the room, accepting the careful respect of collectors who had flown across the country, and he wore it without arrogance, the way a man wears something he earned. For a moment she could not place him, the coveralls traded for clean clothes, the failing truck nowhere in sight. Then she opened the catalog, read the name Merritt printed beside the Pantera, and the cold jolt of it ran straight through her because she finally knew exactly who he was and exactly what building he had bought. The bidding started higher than anyone expected and did not slow. Caleb stood near the back with Owen beside him, watching the numbers climb on the board, his face still, while his pulse was anything but every increment, another wall between him and ruin. 60,000 became 90, became 130, and the room leaned in the way rooms do when they sense a record forming, the dealers and collectors trading glances, the auctioneer's voice riding the energy upward. Giselle watched the board as the figure climbed past anything she had imagined that ruined corner of the world could produce. 150,000. 160. She had walked that lot in heels and written off everything on it without opening a door. And now a single machine that had been sleeping in the building she sold for $1,000 was about to sell for more than the entire row of structures she had dumped. The arithmetic she had always trusted was unraveling in front of her in real time, and she could not look away from it. The hammer fell at $178,000. The room broke into applause, and the Pantera changed hands for a sum that did not just clear the money Caleb had sunk into it, but vindicated every hour, every leak in the roof, every night Owen had doubted out loud. Caleb did not cheer. He let out a long breath, shook Owen's hand once, and felt the whole structure of fear he had been carrying simply set itself down, replaced by a steadiness he had not felt since before the merger. Across the room, Giselle stood very still, while the people around her congratulated a man she had dismissed as a broke dreamer. She had built her entire identity on the certainty that she could read value better than anyone alive, and she was watching the most expensive proof of her error cell under bright lights to applause. The number on the board wasn't just a price, it was the exact measure of everything she had failed to see, and she understood, with a clarity she could not soften, that the failure was hers and no one else's. She found her way toward him through the thinning crowd drawn by something she could not name, and would not have admitted to half intending to say something, and not yet knowing what. Caleb saw her coming. He recognized her instantly, the woman who had signed away a fortune with a smile and a small cruelty dressed as advice, and the recognition did not bring him the anger he might once have expected. It brought him a strange, level calm. The calm of a man standing on the metal he had always known was underneath. Owen saw her too, and stiffened, ready to step between them, but Caleb touched his arm lightly to hold him back. Whatever was about to happen between him and Giselle Harmon was not a thing to be guarded against. It was the conversation the entire last 6 months had been building toward the two of them, and the unbridgeable distance between how they each saw the world, and Caleb intended to meet it the way his father would have, without heat, and without a single wasted word. He turned to face her fully as she reached him, and the noise of the room seemed to fall away. Up close, Giselle Harmon looked smaller than she had in the parking lot 6 months earlier, though nothing about her clothes or her bearing had changed. What had changed was the certainty she usually wore like armor, and its absence left something raw in her face that she clearly was not used to showing anyone. She stopped in front of Caleb with the crowd still thinning around them, and for once, the woman who always had the next sentence ready did not seem to have one. "You knew," she said, finally, and it came out lower than she intended, almost an accusation and almost a confession. "When you stood in front of that building and didn't argue about the price, you already knew what was inside it." Caleb did not deny it, and he did not lie. He told her plainly that he had not known about the cars when he agreed to the price, only that the building was worth opening, and that the difference between them had never been about luck. It had been about whether a person bothered to walk through the door. She took that in the way a person takes a blow they have no defense against, because there was no defense. She had owned the property. She had held the key in her hand and named the price and signed it away. And at no point in any of it had she done the one thing that would have cost her nothing, which was to look. The number still glowing on the board behind them, $178,000 for a single car out of 8, was simply the receipt for that failure made public. "I read that lot 100 times, she said, and there was something close to wonder in it. Now the disbelief of a person watching their own competence dissolve. The zoning, the comparables, the infrastructure timeline. I was never wrong about any of it. Caleb told her she had not been wrong about any of those things, and that this was exactly the problem. She had measured everything that could be measured, and had decided that whatever could not be measured did not exist. That was the heart of it, and they both felt the room narrow to the two of them. She read value through a spreadsheet through location and square footage, and the cold logic of comparables, and within that language she was genuinely brilliant. He read it through the thing his father had taught him, the patience to look past the surface of a thing to what it could still become, the knowledge that ruined and worthless were not the same word, and that the most valuable things were almost always the ones that did not announce themselves. She had spent a career certain that her way was the only serious way, that men like Caleb were sentimental fools who would never close a real deal, and the proof of her error was not abstract. It stood in front of her in clean clothes, owning a company respected by the very collectors whose money she would have killed to command. He had built in half a year on a foundation she had sold him for scrap, the kind of thing she had chased for decades, from a glass tower, and never quite held. "I suppose this is the part where you enjoy it," she said, and the bitterness in it was aimed mostly at herself. She expected him to. She had earned it, and she remembered the small cruelty she had handed him in that parking lot, the advice about optimism and roofs and learning things the expensive way, and she braced for him to hand it back to her now, with interest the way she would have in his place. He did not. Caleb looked at her for a long moment, this woman who had dismissed him and his father's whole philosophy in a single morning, and he found that the victory he was holding did not need her humiliation to feel complete. Revenge would have been a small man's reward, and he had not done any of this to become small. He had done it because his father had been right, and being right was enough. "We were both looking at the same thing," he told her, and his voice held no triumph, in it only a kind of plain honesty. "We just used 2 different tools to measure it. It was not forgiveness exactly, and it was not a truce. It was simply the truest thing he could say about what had happened between them, an observation offered without any edge, and it reached deeper than any insult could have, because she could not argue with it. She studied him then as though seeing him clearly for the first time, not as a category, but as a person, and whatever she had come over to say seemed to leave her. There was nothing to negotiate, nothing to win back, no angle that her considerable skill could work. She had been beaten by a way of seeing she did not possess, and had spent her life dismissing, and the man who had beaten her was not even going to make her feel it. That more than the lost money was what finally landed. "My redevelopment on that lot has stalled," she said at last, and it was the closest she could come to acknowledging the new arrangement of things. She told him then, what she had only just understood herself, that the connector road had made the corner valuable, and that the parcels she needed to move her project forward were the same ones he had quietly bought before she grasped what she had let go. She did not ask. She simply set the fact down between them and let him decide what it meant. Caleb understood the offer hidden inside the statement, and he did not pretend otherwise. He told her that Merit Auto Works was not going anywhere, that the garage and the land around it were the foundation of everything he was building, and not a thing he would sell back to her at any price. But he also told her, without warmth and without malice, that a project like hers and a company like his did not have to be enemies on the same corner, and that she knew where to find him if she ever wanted to talk about the difference between tearing something down and building on it. It was not an alliance, and it was not a rejection. It was a door left unlocked, which was more than she had left him in that parking lot, and she recognized the asymmetry of it. She gave him a single nod, the nod of a person acknowledging a debt that could never quite be repaid, and then she turned and walked back into the crowd smaller than she had arrived, and aware of it carrying away the most expensive lesson of a career built on never needing to learn one. In the months that followed, Merit Auto Works became the thing Caleb had seen on the night he first pulled the tarps back. The remaining cars were restored one by one, each sale feeding the company, instead of merely saving it, and the contracts grew from rare private machines to commissions that put the shop's name in the same magazines that had put his face on a cover. He hired more hands, trained them the way his father would have, and the half-collapsed garage gave way to a real facility built around it. He kept the old building, though. He could have torn it down and built clean the way Giselle would have, the way the numbers recommended, and he chose not to. The new shop rose around the old garage and absorbed it, and at the center of all of it, surrounded by gleaming walls and serious equipment, the original structure remained repaired, but unmistakably itself. The men who worked there knew it was where everything had started, even if they did not know all of why. Owen ran the floor as a partner, now his knees no better, but his doubt long gone. And the two of them had built the kind of place where serious work got done by people who understood what they were looking at. The trust Caleb had risked everything to earn at that auction had compounded the way trust does into more work than they could take, and a name that no spreadsheet could have manufactured. He had become, in the language his father would have used, a man who built rather than a man who got by. On the evening the new facility was finally complete, Caleb came back alone after everyone had gone home. He walked through the dark of the new shop, past the lifts and the benches and the machines he could now afford, until he reached the old garage, at its heart the original building that had cost him $1,000 and nearly everything else. He stood in it, the way he had stood in it, that first night, when it had held 8 sleeping fortunes and a future he could not yet see. There was one wall he had ordered the crews never to touch, a cracked section of the original structure, the same wall that had split from foundation to eave when Giselle Harmon called the place condemned in everything but paperwork. He had preserved it on purpose, refused every contractor's suggestion to repair or hide it, because he wanted the reminder. He wanted to stand here and see every day the exact thing that everyone else had seen and walked away from. He took his father's notebook from his jacket, the same worn book he had read every night in the room above the shuttered hardware store, and he opened it to the first page in the quiet. The line was still there in heavy block letters, the only inheritance that had ever mattered. Other men see the rust. You look for the metal underneath it. He had read it 10,000 times, and standing in the building those words had bought, He understood it now in a way he never had before. It had never really been about cars. His father had been writing about the world, about the way value hides itself under whatever makes it easy to dismiss, and about the kind of person willing to look anyway, when looking is inconvenient, and the easy thing is to keep walking. Giselle Harmon had been brilliant and certain and completely blind, and the distance between her career and his had come down to whether a person believed that ruined and worthless meant the same thing. He closed the notebook and looked at the cracked wall one last time before reaching for the lights. The truth he had built his life on was simple enough to fit on a single page, and most of the world would keep walking past it, the way they walked past everything that did not gleam. Real value almost always wore an ordinary face, and the whole distance between a man who succeeded and a man who failed could come down to nothing more than how the two of them looked at the very same thing. Caleb stepped out into the night and locked the door behind him, the same swollen door he had forced open 6 months and a lifetime ago. The lot around him was no longer a graveyard. It was the ground beneath something real, something he had seen when no one else had bothered to look, and somewhere across town, a woman who measured the world in numbers was learning to live with the one figure she would never stop seeing. He drove home through the quiet streets of Halford, and for the first time since the merger, the truck's brakes were new.